Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Continuing off again from our last discussion, where I was doing a show and tell and taking you through the ideal arrangement and the ideal typographic representation of different parts of the book. Before I move on to a new part of the book, I would like to just refresh your memories a little bit by discussing the table of contents, which is where we had stopped last time. The one on the top left, which has the big thick line, that black line is actually a design element from the rest of the book, as is the grey bar on which sits the page number 2. The contents, along with the rest of the preliminary pages in this book, will have these lines and grey boxes because, in fact, these lines and grey boxes are connected to the design of the rest of the book. One purpose of the preliminary pages, as well as the table of contents, is to present a bird's eye view not only of the entire content and to let you know how it is arranged, but also to present you with glimpses of the design motifs that have been used throughout the book, so that later in the pages, when you do encounter them, they do not come as a rude shock or a surprise. In this particular book that I am discussing, you will see on the table of contents that the grey box indicating page number 2 is a deliberate highlight because that is the beginning of a particular section called Conversation as Alternative Mapping. So, obviously, you will realize that after the front matter in this book, the book is divided into several sections. Each section has a title, and within that section are other chapters pertaining to the theme of that particular section. Now, this entire conversation that I'm having with you, I am now actually explaining it to you, but if I was not there and if I had gifted this book to you or you came across it in a library or a bookshop, just by looking at the table of contents, just by seeing how we have typographically used space, various typefaces, sizes, etc., we are wordlessly, we the typesetters and or book designers, we are wordlessly communicating to you the structure of the book, how it has been arranged, and therefore in your hands how it should be read. Please note that the name of the section is a bit bold. Thereafter, the same typeface but in regular upper-lower case has been used for the name of the chapters, and then the person with whom the conversations are happening, their names have been highlighted in another slightly bold font. Please note also that the thick black line that I had initially mentioned is being almost used as a margin to separate the page numbers on one side and the chapter titles or the book part titles on the other side. Please also note the gap that has been deliberately maintained between the arrangement of front matter towards the top of the page and then the start of part 1. Now, a far less complicated table of contents appears on the top right. You will notice that all table of contents must in fact have the word contents right at the top of the page. We have here a very classically arranged table of contents on the top right. Acknowledgements and foreword are part of the book's front matter, so they are represented on the table of contents in italics. The front matter page numbers often appear, and in fact ideally should appear, in lowercase Roman numerals. Please keep this in mind. The software that you are using to design the book, whether it is a software called Quark Express or a software called InDesign, allows you to change the representation of page numbers with just one click. So, when we are working within the preliminary pages of a book, when we are working on the front matter of a book, we must bear in mind that the pagination must appear, wherever the page numbers appear, they must appear in lowercase Roman numerals and ideally in italics. And when we represent parts of the front matter on the table of contents, those parts are also shown in italics often. It is becoming less and less mandatory, but it is a bit of typesetting elegance that can be maintained to separate in italics the front matter and then in italics the back matter, and to have the body text or the bulk of the book in Roman text, or what we know as plain text, or simply uppercase and lowercase as we are used to. This also creates the visual sense of the front and the back matter sort of bracketing the main text, which forms the bulk of the book. In this case, on the top left, you can see, on the top right, I beg your pardon, is acknowledgements and foreword, which is the front matter and is therefore in italics. And at the end, you can see two bits more in italic. One is called chronology and one is called a selection of Liszt's music. That forms part of the back matter to this book, and therefore you can see that on this table of contents how the front matter and the back matter have been italicized and a sort of bracket or nestle the main text between them. On the lower left is a very important and a very, in fact, complicated table of contents, although we have arranged it in such a way that we hope that it is no longer complicated. There are three bits of preliminary matter. There is acknowledgements, a preliminary note, and a preface. These are in the front. They form the front matter of the book. Therefore, you will notice that they are in italics. Then we have an introduction by the author. If you look at the page numbers, you will notice that the introduction starts on page 1 and then the next chapter starts on 23. Now, this is what we would call a chapter length introduction. 22 pages is quite substantial for an introduction. Therefore, although sometimes introductions can definitely be part of the front matter, in this particular case, we have preferred to start the book with it. Going on, the next chapter is a chapter called France and French Literature. And now I want you to pay particular attention, because here we have a lot of divisions and in fact sub-subdivisions. The first subdivision, or what we in typesetting terminology would call subhead A, appears as introduction and then as 20th century French prose. You can see how we have represented them with upper, lower, bold typeface, and it has got a one finger, almost what looks visually like a one finger indent from the margin. Within this, within the category 20th century French prose, 3 or 4 writers have been discussed. They form subhead B. These are Jean-Paul Sartre and André Malraux, Marguerite Duras, Albert Camus, and one other person. Now, if you look at this, the typesetter and or the book designer had to plan for this at the beginning of the book. So it is very important when you are typesetting and or book designing that you go through the Microsoft Word document that is in fact sent to you, and you kind of at least speed read the content, so that when you come down to typesetting the book, you are mentally prepared for the various levels of text that exist on the pages, and that it is now your task to show through the use of what we call type styles. You have to plan how you're going to differentiate between them. Some will be bold, some will be all caps, some will be all small caps, maybe upper, lower, whatever variations are available to you. Sometimes you can use a color or a shade of gray if the book is going to be printed in color. If the use of color is not an option, then a shade of gray always is. But you have to know all of this at the beginning. Halfway through the book, you cannot suddenly discover that you have to change all your typography because you had not in fact been aware and therefore could not plan in advance what the various styles would be for the different levels of text. In my earlier lectures, I had discussed while I was talking about the basic design elements or basic design principles, I had talked about dominance, I have talked about repetition, I had talked about hierarchy. In a book like this, levels of importance, therefore levels of dominance, are being created by the clever use of typography. After that, the second subhead that you can see is French poetry. Now we have something very interesting happening, which is within that subhead, there are more subheads. So French poetry itself has an introduction, right? Now this is not an introduction to the chapter, this is an introduction to the section. I want you to pay particular attention to how we have represented both of these introductions. If you can see the line just under France and French literature, that introduction in upper lower bold case is an introduction to the entire chapter. Therefore, we can imagine that in that particular introduction, the author has explained how and what regions of France he has looked at and what aspects of French literature he will be discussing. It is an overall discussion of the entire chapter. If you compare the type treatment of that introduction to the type treatment of the word introduction as it appears beneath French poetry, you will realize with two things. One, that it is looking different, the introduction word above. So it has an indent. Whereas the first introduction had a one finger push, this seems to have a two finger push. You automatically therefore realize that this particular introduction, which also appears in all small caps, is now an introduction to 20th century French poetry, and therefore it is a very specific to just the French poetry, I beg your pardon, and is going to be specific to that section. Then within it, you will see how the author has organized the work. Within French poetry, we have two more sections. Within French poetry, we have 19th century French poetry, and then we have 20th century French poetry. With inside that section with more indents, you then have the names of the poets in italics. So can you see that one of the reasons why I have chosen this particular table of contents is that while you're going through this, you are automatically realizing how you will read this book, how detailed the content is, how it will appear in what we call nested sections, one within the other. And we have highlighted those nested sections much in the manner of those Russian dolls, which you can open and there's another doll inside and another doll inside. This entire thing has been represented with the use of indentation or white space on the left and through the use of type treatment, right? And this is possible if you have gone through the book in detail and you have realized that this is how the book is arranged, because a lot of the type styles that are used here for each level of subhead, it is entirely possible that this is then replicated in the layout itself. On the page also, the introduction to French poetry possibly appears in all small caps, the introduction to the chapter appears bold, upper, lower, etc. The last sample here of the table of contents is fairly elementary. Acknowledgements appears in italics as it should, and then there is a back matter comprising Appendix 1, Appendix 2, references cited and index. This is an table of contents from what we call an academic volume. An academic volume is written by a scholar on a particular aspect of his, her or their research and is meant to be read by other scholars and other students in that field. It is a book that is predominantly comprised of text. It's entirely possible it has some fieldwork pictures or some pictures of sort of historic anthropological importance, sometimes no pictures at all, perhaps only maps or diagrams or pie charts, depending on the subject matter. And here, as you can see, there's just the acknowledgements and significant amounts of back matter. Academic books must have a section at the end called references cited. It can sometimes also be called works cited. It can sometimes be called a bibliography or a select bibliography. And of course, an index is invaluable. One of the reasons why I have chosen this particular table of contents is to show you how simply arranging them on a page is not enough. They must have space between them, space between each chapter, space then between each section. And here, if you will notice something of great importance, there are two factors. It's been there before also, but it's more noticeable here, which is look at the numbers on the right hand side. Note the number 1. The number 1 is in line with 5, 7, 6, etc. below it. Then note the number 2 in 25. 20 is aligned with the 70, is aligned with the 30, and so on. And then the page numbers go into the hundreds. Please pay extra attention to when you are putting the page numbers, align them from the right hand side onwards. Okay, so the units and then the tens and then the hundreds and maybe perhaps the thousands. This can be done sometimes with a combination of pushing the tab button on your keyboards and then the space bar a few times if you need to manually adjust it. But I would request you to pay attention to this for neater, better typesetting. Please also observe that when you do have the back matter represented on a table of contents, and that applies to this page as well as to the table of contents just above it, please note that even though the numbers remain in the Arabic that we are used to, the regular 1, 2, 3, 4s as a layperson would call it, but the back matter numbers are made italic to respect the idea that front and back matter appear in italics and only the block of the book appears in plain text. Now, what may come after the table of contents is a page that may or may not be there in the book that you are designing, and you will notice on the top of this particular slide, I have given you an option of recto or verso. Once your table of contents has been taken care of, it doesn't matter if you have a list of illustrations, if it appears on the left or the right hand side page. Earlier, I had mentioned that it is mandatory for a table of contents to begin on the right hand side. It may overflow onto other pages, but it must begin on the right hand side. In the calculation that I have taught you, page 1 is the half title page, page 2 is the frontispiece page, which may or may not have a picture. Page 3 is the full title page. When you turn the full title page, if you will remember, is the full title of the book, the full subtitle of the book, name of the photographer, author, illustrator, translator, everybody who's worked on the manuscript, and remember that logo at the bottom, which is mandatory. The full title page is always on page 3. Then comes the title verso, which is on page 4. The title verso is also known as the copyright page. Now, in any book that you design, in whichever language that you are designing it for, up to the title verso, you cannot deviate from this arrangement. Please understand this. You must have a half title. You may use the half title for a half title, you may use it for an author write-up, a series note write-up, or in fact a summary of the book, no problem. The book will open on page 1, that page 1 is known as a half title. Then you do have to turn the page to page 2. You have no option. If you have nothing to put on page 2, leave it blank. If you have an image that applies to the entire content, it will be called the frontispiece and you can put it on page 2. If you don't have an image, but the publisher has other books by that author or other books in that series, you may ask them if they want to list them on page 2. Page 3 has to be, there is no option but for page 3 to be the title page with the full list of the title, subtitle and everybody who's worked on the book. And then page 4 must have name of the publisher, date, ISBN number, copyright information, address of the publisher, any other details like who has done the designing of the book or the typesetting, where was the book printed, all of this has to come on page 4. So in any book that you do, the minimum number of front matter pages is 4 pages. After that is where the variations then begin to come. I say variations because you may or may not have a dedication on page 5. You may or may not have an epigraph or an opening quotation. The book, if it is a straightforward novel that just begins on page 1 and ends on page 200, sometimes novels do not have a table of contents. Do you understand what I'm saying? Therefore, what happens is, in any book up to page 4, there can be no conversation that those 4 pages are mandatory. After page 5, you may or may not have other things, in which case everything moves up to occupy the position before it. Suppose you have nothing. Suppose there is no dedication, there is no epigraph, there is no table of contents. What do? You end your front matter at page 4 and you begin on the right hand side with page 1 of the novel or the poem that begins, whatever you have, or the first page of the textbook, the first page of the art catalogue. It's entirely possible to begin at 1. But remember, prelims minimum is 4 pages, ending at the copyright page, and another overall note or warning is, as you go along, no matter how long or how short your prelims are, preliminary pages of front matter must end on the left hand side, because page 1 in the book will always come on the right hand side. So whether there is text or no text, a left hand side blank page, if necessary, can end your front matter file on the computer, and then you open another file starting from the right hand side, starting from regular page 1, which is where your main book should begin. Now here, a list of illustrations, if it is so required, is often and most usually provided by the author. It is possible in some books that the design is such that while images do appear alongside the text, sometimes a quarter page, full page, going across the bottom of a page, appearing on the top of a page, sometimes there can be more than one illustration on a page. Sometimes it is possible that the design is such that it is not possible or desirable to have the captions of the pictures appear on the page itself. In that case, the captions may appear separately in what we call a list of illustrations. You may have a list of illustrations in the front of the book, or you may have a list of illustrations at the back of the book. It is entirely dependent on the content, and the decision very often is taken either by the author or the editor. It is merely up to you to set it typographically as clearly as you possibly can in whichever position has been indicated to you. Just for your information, a list of illustrations, as I have over here, you'll notice the first one has been clustered alphabetically. Please note that the typesetter has left a little extra space between each alphabet, right? So the A cluster has 3, then the B cluster of image captions has about 4 or 5, and so on. So you as the reader, you immediately recognize this when you look at it, and later in the book or after even reading the book, if you want to look up a particular illustration, then you realize that you come to the list of illustrations, get to the alphabet of the first alphabet of its name, and you can very quickly find the page number. Please also note that this is a 2-column list of illustrations. In a book whose format is fairly wide, it is possible that the text box or the text block within which you are working is quite generously shaped, in which case you can have more information on each page, or at least in certain pages, by choosing to make the box 2-column and prevent the waste of space. The lower option of the list of illustrations has a little explanatory note that the author has provided in italics, after which you can see we have longish picture captions where you first begin with the name of the artist, then you have the name of the work, then you have a date, and then you have the medium. Please note that when we represent works of art, this comprises a full detailed caption, and this is the ideal order in which each of those details must appear. So, to repeat, if you look at the first one, name of the artist, comma, then we have the name of the work. Any work of art, whether it's a painting, a drawing, a sculpture, even if the work of art is called untitled, the name of the work of art must appear in italics. Please be aware of this. Then we have the date, and after that we have the medium. One thing that is in fact missing here and could be added if you do have access to that information is the dimensions of the work of art. We don't have the dimensions mentioned here, but they often do appear, because when you look at a picture of a painting or of a sculpture in a book, it is sometimes not possible to understand if it is very large in real life, how magnificent the scale was or is rather of that painting or of that sculpture, or sometimes it could be the reverse. Maybe you have a very big picture of it here in the book, but in real life it's actually a very, very detailed miniature. So if it is up to you, then you must try and collate all of these details, and you must in fact try and add the measurements if you can perhaps locate them online, or ask the editor who is working with you on the book, or ask the author if they can supply those. Ideally, all the measurements should be in one particular unit of measurement. So either all the measurements are in inches, or they are in centimeters, or they are in millimeter. Try to avoid going from one to the other. The next following few details here are Amsterdam Rijksmuseum, Foto Rijksmuseum Stichting Amsterdam. Now there are two things here. One is the Amsterdam Rijksmuseum, which means that is where this particular work of art is located. And then you have what we call a photo credit. It is very, very important to give a credit for where you have got the image from, even if the image is now in the public domain and is copyright free, and you technically don't have to thank anyone, right? So sometimes when I am working on a book that has some art images, even if I have got the picture of that painting from Wikimedia, I will still put the credit here at the end of the book, and I will say photo Wikimedia Commons. Someone has done us the service of providing a high resolution color corrected image of a work of art and put it online in, sort of under the Creative Commons license so that we can use it. I make sure that the license for that image, and this is something to which you should pay attention, because many people assume that because an image is available on the internet, it is free for use. It is not so. We have discussed copyright very briefly in one of my previous lectures. Any photograph, any work of art done by somebody and put up on the internet doesn't mean that they are waiving copyright. It is theirs very much so, and if you want to use it in a book, or you want to use it on a book cover, or in some kind of print publication project, you must in fact contact them and seek their permission. Often what happens is 70 or 80 or 100 years after the death of a creator, their work comes into what we call the public domain. The term of their ownership or copyright expires, and then the larger public is free to use their work as they wish. Sometimes people who are very much alive, still they put up their photographs that they have taken or their paintings, but they specify. Sometimes they say free for personal use, but not for commercial use, which means you can print a poster out of it for yourself in your room, or you can use it in a school project or a college project, but you cannot use it commercially, which automatically and immediately means you can't use it inside a book or on a book cover, because that is commercial use. A book will be sold for a certain sum of money. Somebody will earn from that. So be very careful, because many people are helping each other by releasing their work into the public domain with what we are calling Creative Commons licenses, but there are shades and degrees to that licenses. Somebody will say, as I have just said, for personal use only, not for commercial use. Some other license will say for commercial use only in India, or only in the US, or only in the UK. Yet another person will say for commercial use, but without any alterations or modifications, which means you must and you absolutely have to use the photograph or the painting as it is. You can't change the colors, you can't alter how it looks, you can't put funny things on it, you can't cut the head of the statue and put the head of a bunny rabbit on it. You can't touch it. It must go as it is wherever you are using it. And it goes without saying that you must always credit whose work you are using. So you must say photo by such and such, image available on, let's say, Wikimedia Commons. Yet another kind of Creative Commons license will tell you available for, yes, I am letting you use it commercially, but you can't put any text on it. This is their way of saying basically that you can put it maybe inside a book, right? I went on a holiday, let's say, to the Ajanta Ellora caves, and I took some beautiful pictures of the cave paintings, and I come back and I just like them so much, I want to share them with the world. I come back from my holiday and I upload my pictures onto Wikimedia Commons, and I say, however, yes, you can use it for both personal and commercial use, but without modification and without any text. This, to a designer like me, automatically means I cannot use it for a book cover, because a book cover cannot exist without text on it. So in my mind, when I come across an instance like that, I realize that if I'm doing an illustrated book on the Ajanta Ellora caves, maybe I'm designing a textbook for young people, I can use that picture inside the book, but I can't put it outside, because the person releasing that picture, the person who took that picture, has specified in their license that even though it can be used commercially, I'm not allowed to put text on it. I have gone into this in great detail because many people are completely unaware of the different shades and degrees of the Creative Commons licenses. There is a big error in our thinking that just because it's on Wikimedia, it's available. Just because it's on the internet, I can download it and I can use it. You can't. People can bring lawsuits against you for using their copyrighted material without permission. Just as you are getting things off the internet, remember, somebody can also take a picture of your work and put it up on the internet. Things are circulating all the time. People are coming to know about things all the time, and you should not get into trouble. So yes, use the Creative Commons material, use the internet for visual research, right? But then make sure that what you are ultimately using in the book that you are designing is in fact either you have got the permission from the person who has taken the photograph or that made that painting, or you are getting images very clearly that are now free of copyright, available absolutely without any conditions in the public domain, free for use in your country by anyone for any purpose whatsoever. Okay, please be very careful about this, because the internet makes it seem as if everything in the world is available for good design, but it's not. It's a very tricky area, and you have to be very careful, and you have to be very respectful of what you are taking from where and using for what. So here on the bottom is the ideal circumstances and the ideal details of the material that makes up a good caption for a work of art. We have covered it. The next feature or the next object or part of a book that may be present in a book is, of course, just like you had a list of illustrations, sometimes you have very heavy sort of statistics related books or books with a lot of tables, lot of data that is given in the form of tables, and it's good for the reader to have some kind of a little shorthand indication of how many tables there are, what the tables are all about, where can I find them quickly when I just need very quick access to the data in those tables. And therefore here we have, just like you had the list of illustrations, you have a list of tables in the front. Please note that this one on the left hand side has the tables arranged by chapter. It has also done something very intelligent, which is table 3.1, 3.2, 3.3. Can you see how intelligently the tables are numbered? Everything beginning with a 3 belongs to chapter 3. Everything beginning with 4 point something, you automatically realize belongs to chapter 4. Please note how they are clustered between chapters. If you look on the right hand side, something that I want to draw your attention to, and that's very important, which is that this list of tables has what I call hanging indentation. All lists where they appear in the book, list of illustrations, list of tables, a list inside the content, 1, 2, 3. Sometimes people say, I have 4 points that are very important, and here they are, colon, and then you have 1, 2, 3, 4. Sometimes when you have a work cited or a references cited or a bibliography at the end of the book, when you have an index at the end of the book, anything that is a list, either alphabetically arranged or arranged by number, or sometimes even just with little dashes or little bullets, those kind of lists require, I would say mandatorily require, good typography requires the application of a hanging indentation. A hanging indentation basically means the first line hangs out. As you can see, the numbers, the one on the right hand side, the numbers are hanging out and the text is pushed in. This makes it very, very easy to navigate that list, to jump from number to number. You may not necessarily want to read 1, 2, 3, 4. You may want table number 2, then you might want to read table number 6. This makes it very, very easy to get to the part that you want to. So I would heartily recommend the use of hanging indentation in lists. Now, after all this is done, it is possible that the book has a foreword. Now, there is a big difference between a foreword and a preface, and I would really like you to keep in mind, because the amount of confusion between these two is multiplying on a daily basis, which is quite shameful really. A foreword, please note the spelling, it's not a forward, it's not let's march forward, okay, or fast forward. Some of you may be hoping that I would do that to this lecture, which is fast forwarded. A foreword is a brief note about the book that is provided by somebody other than the author. Okay, you have a book, let's say on physics, and you get a very famous physics professor to write a foreword to that book. Not an introduction is much longer. If they do write a chapter length introduction, which is 10 pages or 15 pages or 22 pages, then it is called introduction. Sometimes you will see books that say, you know, there's a book title, there's the name of the author, and then it says introduced by or with a new introduction by, no problem. But if the length of what that person has written is shorter, if it's only 2 pages, if it's only 3 pages, then it's called a foreword. I am saying this with a lot of emphasis because a foreword is different from a preface. A preface is a brief note on the book written by the author themselves. Never say a foreword by the author. Okay? A foreword means it is by somebody else, and therefore at the end or at the beginning, that depends entirely on the style of the book, on the editor's choice, on your choice sometimes, a foreword must have the name of the person who has written it, because it is not the author. But a preface must never have the name of the author, because it is understood, it is like a double signature. A preface can be written by no one other than the author themselves. What is the difference between a preface and an introduction? Many people ask this. It is possible for a book to have both. A preface is when the author writes very few words, 2 pages, maybe sometimes a page and a half, a very brief note on the book. An introduction can be by the author. The only difference between the preface and the introduction is that an introduction is much longer. An introduction is at least 10 pages. An introduction can pass off as a full chapter, right? So if the author has a lot to say about the book, it becomes an introduction. If it's a few paragraphs, just a few pages, it's a preface. And if the author got a famous personality to write a few words on the book, that part of the book is called a foreword. And because guests to us are more important, it is a question not only of good typesetting, good book arrangement, but also of courtesy and hospitality, to let the guest speak first. So in a book that has a foreword and a preface, the foreword by the guest person must appear first. Then the author must wait to have his turn. In this particular case, this is a book that was on Mahatma Gandhi and Mahatma Gandhi's relationship with Bengal. It was written by the then governor of Bengal, Shri Gopal Krishna Gandhi. Shri Gandhi requested Amartya Sen to write the foreword, right? So here you have, as you can see, the caption to this, or the heading to this part of the book, is called Foreword. You have 3 pages written by Professor Amartya Sen, and therefore, because Professor Amartya Sen is the guest writer in this case, he is not the author of the book, the foreword has his name at the bottom. But when Shri Gandhi's preface appears, we don't add his name to the bottom. It's understood that the preface is by the author. I have taken a long time to explain this deliberately, because these days people are confusing the use of the foreword and the preface and forgetting who belongs to which, and they're putting the author's name in the wrong place, etc., etc. Now you know better, and I hope that you will not make the same mistake. The foreword is followed, as you can see, by the preface by the author. Depending on how many times a book has gone to print, you may be requested by the publisher to reproduce one or more prefaces just to capture the publishing history of the book. So this book has gone into a 2nd edition. You have a preface. As you can see, they are really tiny bits of text. The preface to the 2nd edition is appearing on the left-hand side, and the preface to the older edition has been reproduced for historic interest on the right-hand side. Under ideal circumstances, if I was the publisher of this book, I would only keep London 1980 and London 1994. It is in fact an error to reproduce the author's name at the bottom of the preface. So that is a mistake and should not be here. Once the preface is taken care of, in certain books, you may have an acknowledgements section, and acknowledgements is usually a thank you from the author and or editors of the book to all the people who helped them. This can be friends, family, people in their university, people they got some money from to do a research project, anyone, people in the library who helped them locate books, manuscripts, etc., etc. Acknowledgements is usually a whole list of thank yous with the author expressing gratitude to everybody who has helped them. Acknowledgements also, the funny thing about acknowledgements is they may or may not appear in the beginning. If some authors like their acknowledgements to come in the beginning of the book, and some authors like their acknowledgements to come right at the end, both are possible. It is primarily a question of the author's choice, and or if the editor of the book decides to make a change from front to back. In this case, we have something called an introductory note. An introductory note, not quite an introduction, sort of borderline between preface and introduction. It's possible for someone to go this route. There's an introductory note here by the author, which can then follow. I've tried to get you as much of a bulky front matter as possible, just to let you know and to visually show you the different parts that may or may not be there. It is not mandatory that there be a foreword. It is not mandatory that there be a preface. But suppose you have a book where both appear, you now know the order in which you have to arrange them, okay? If there is no foreword, don't badger the author to write one. If there is no preface, wonderful, skip that part. Go and see what else there is in the front matter, right? Here, we have a list of abbreviations depending on the kind of book that it is. This was in fact a book about economics and the stock market and banks and all of that. And there was a long list of recurring, when I say recurring, I mean coming throughout the book, a long list of abbreviations. And sometimes it was becoming very difficult to keep track of what this meant or what that meant. These are not abbreviations that we are not sort of just familiar with in our day-to-day life. So an editorial decision was made to pluck these abbreviations out of the text and to give like a mini handbook, like a mini listing at the beginning, so that while the reader was reading through the book, if at any point they came across an abbreviation and they lost track and they couldn't keep count and they were like, what is this? They remembered the list of abbreviations in the front and they could jump to it and refresh their memory. So this functions almost as a reading aid to the reader. Okay, it is again not mandatory, but should it appear, then as a typesetter, as a book designer, you should remember that it needs to be part of the front matter. The next is an interesting part of the book, which is something called a chronology. You may have seen this in some books that you have read. It was very popular once upon a time, which is nowadays, in sort of casual layperson's terms, you would call it a timeline. Okay, in this particular book from where I have taken, it is a life of Henrik Ibsen, and even before you start to read the book, you get a bird's eye view. What happened in which years was significant. Some years were significant in his life, but he was living through an interesting time. So what were the historic, political, social changes that were occurring when he was born, as he was growing up, as he was writing? In some cases, he may have been reacting to them. In some cases, he may have been including them in his work. In some cases, perhaps there was the death of somebody or he got married. So there is a bird's eye view of the main years in his life and in the circumstances of his life. And the editors and or the author have decided that it is important to have that like a kind of almost like a historic background before you delve into the work, so that it kind of takes you into that landscape that he was living in, and you kind of rewire your brain a little bit and you figure out that, okay, this is the world, the time, the life that he was living. This is what I'm going to plunge into now when I start reading this book. Here too, as you can see, a hanging indentation has been applied so that the dates look almost as if they are in a separate column and the explanations are a little apart from the text. And it is entirely an editorial decision for whether the chronology will be at the front of the book or at the back. Both are possible. Right? So don't get rattled if you see it at the back. It depends entirely on how the content is laid out and how the editor and or the author wants you to proceed. Sometimes the timeline is interesting but is a little incidental to the text, in which case it comes at the back. But if it is vital that you understand the life and times right at the beginning, then you have it in the front. Okay? So this actually will help you understand that many parts of the book actually arise from the content itself. Many of the parts are fluid, and what is important is for the author and the editor to realize that this needs to be read before, this may be read after, and you as a book designer then follow that and design the book accordingly. We are almost at the end of the front matter, and before I wind up today's lecture, I would like you to look at the bit on the left hand side. It is very simple. You may have seen this in some of the books that you have written. It is basically a list of characters. It is what we would call almost like a cast and crew. This comes in books that are play scripts. This comes in books that are film scripts. An introduction of the characters followed by either the people who played them on stage or on screen, or a brief description. So it could be Lalita, a woman in her 40s, Ranjit, her son, aged 8, little things like that, right? It's fairly simple, but unavoidable and elementary and quite fundamental to play scripts and film scripts. And last but not least, it's possible that the translator, in the case of a translation, may wish to have a brief note, almost like a preface, which explains. Often this becomes very important in the case of a translation, because the translator takes this opportunity to explain some of the translation sort of policies or principles that they have followed, certain preferences for word choices. When a word in a native language can have maybe 6 different replicas in the English, the translator could use this brief note to explain why they have gone with which choice, give a little bit of a logic about how the text unfolds. And that brings us to the end of the preliminary pages or the front matter of the book. I have tried to explain how, through understanding the content first, understanding the book, through the good use of typography, differences in type styles, and the clever use of space and indentation, you can arrange this in the most pleasing, most practical, and most efficient way. In my next lecture, I will discuss aspects of the main text. Thank you for listening.
Hello and welcome to this piece of literary snippet. Today we are going to read a section from Virginia Woolf's novel Orlando. And the section that we are going to listen to today is perhaps one of the finest descriptions of the winter season in English literature. It is also a very fine piece of what we call fantasy writing. I have made a few changes to the original to adapt it for the purpose of reading. The Great Frost was, historians tell us, the most severe that has ever visited these islands. Birds froze in mid-air and fell like stones to the ground. At Norwich, a young countrywoman started to cross the road in her usual robust health and was seen by the onlookers to turn visibly to powder and be blown in a puff of dust over the roofs. The mortality among sheep and cattle was enormous. Corpses froze and could not be drawn from the sheets. It was no uncommon sight to come upon a whole herd of swine frozen immovable upon the road. The fields were full of shepherds, ploughmen, teams of horses, and little bird-scaring boys, all struck stark in the act of the moment. One with his hand to his nose, another with a bottle to his lips, a third with a stone raised to throw at the ravens, who sat upon the hedge within a yard of him as if they were stuffed birds. The severity of the frost was so extraordinary that a kind of petrification sometimes ensued. It was commonly supposed that the great increase of rocks in some parts of Derbyshire was due to no eruption, for there was no eruptions. Rather, it was supposed that they were due to the solidification of unfortunate wayfarers who had been turned literally to stones where they stood. The church could give little help in the matter, and though some landowners had these relics blessed, the most part preferred to use them either as landmarks, scratching posts for sheep, or when the form of the stone allowed, drinking troughs for cattle, which purpose they serve admirably for the most part to this day. But while the country people suffered the extremity of want, and the trade of the country was at a standstill, London enjoyed a carnival of utmost brilliance. The new king directed that the river, which was frozen to a depth of 20 feet, should be swept, decorated, and given all the semblance of a park or pleasure ground, with arbors, mazes, alleys, drinking booths, all at his expense, of course. Frozen roses fell in showers when the queen and her ladies walked abroad. Colored balloons hovered motionless in the air. Here and there burnt vast bonfires of cedar and oak wood, lavishly salted so that the flame were of green, orange, and purple fire. But however fiercely they burnt, the heat was not enough to melt the ice, which, though of singular transparency, was yet of the hardness of steel. So clear, indeed, was the ice that there could be seen, congealed at a depth of several feet, here a porpoise, there a flounder. Shoals of eels lay motionless in a trance, but whether their state was one of death or merely of suspended animation which the warmth would revive, puzzled the philosophers. In short, nothing could exceed the brilliancy and gaiety of the scene by day. But it was at night that the carnival was at its merriest. The nights were of perfect stillness. The moon and stars blazed with the hard fixity of diamonds, and to the fine music of flute and trumpet the courtiers danced. See you in the next episode of Literary Snippet.
Hello, I am A.K. Sharma and I teach sociology in IIT Kanpur. I am trying to answer a simple question: how sociologists explain their facts. As you know that sociology was developed as a subject dealing with human behavior, but which would use the tools and techniques of science, mathematics, physics, chemistry. But this view that human behavior needs to be studied scientifically has been contradicted later on, and it was said that simply by relating one kind of facts with other kinds of facts, you cannot understand human behavior. To understand human behavior or to actually theorize about human behavior, you have to theorize the theories or motivations or meanings that people have in their mind in involving in a particular action. Now, using these two traditions, one tradition in which we relate one fact of society with other facts scientifically, and another tradition in which we try to develop second order constructs or theories that people have in their mind in acting in day to day life. They have produced two different traditions in sociology. One is called quantitative, another is called qualitative. Quantitative methodology uses scientific methods of conducting surveys, censuses, experiments, and then by using statistical methods, from simple method like arithmetic mean to sophisticated methods like logistic regression, we try to arrive at some inference. Qualitative tradition, qualitative methodology on the other hand uses ethnographic approach, and here the researcher attempts to become part of the community which he or she intends to study, because the assumption is that only by becoming part of the community, by living among the people whom you are studying, and by putting yourself in their shoes, by trying to understand things or their environment or their behavior or their culture or festivals or economic behavior or politics from their angle, from their perspective, how they feel, what understanding they carry in their mind, that only by understanding these things we can understand facts of society. Actually, in one of the latest works World Bank, which uses a lot of statistics, has also talked about understanding mental models that people use in involving in behavior. Emile Durkheim long back said that sociology uses comparative method, and let me just give one example and then I will finish. Suppose I tell you that infant mortality rate in India is 40. What does it mean? It means nothing. But when you compare infant mortality of India today with Japan and you find that Japan has 2 and India has 40, then you get disturbed. Then you start thinking, why is it that infant mortality in India is so high? And then you can also compare infant mortality of India with infant mortality of say Kenya or Mozambique or other countries, and you find that these countries have much higher infant mortality than India. And then you can create a hypothesis that perhaps economic development has something to do with infant mortality. Countries which are more developed, countries like Japan, they have low infant mortality. Countries like Mozambique or Kenya, which are less developed, have higher infant mortality. So, you have a connection. This is what sociology is about, connection between facts. So, by using census, surveys, by conducting field work, by using ethnographic methods, by using comparative methods, we arrive at sociological findings. Use of experimental method in sociology has been very less, but I learned that recently economists, which 10 years ago I could not see that economists will one day use experimental method, but today we find that economists are using a lot of experimental methods to study human behavior. Now, this work may be done by economists, but the findings of their study can very well be called sociological studies. So, sociology tomorrow, I think that sociology tomorrow, in addition to using surveys and comparative methods, will also be using experimental methods. Thank you.